start out with Circle, and then move on to Hens afterwards. And last but not least, Arne. And should there be time after that, supervisors are also allowed. But no question from audience has been announced, so you can more or less spend the time.
Right. Okay, thank you very much, Martin, and thank you, Anja, for a very good presentation on behalf of all of us. We very much enjoyed it, and you were able to summarize a very very concisely the whole thesis, and we thoroughly enjoyed it. I also want to thank the opportunity of being asked to come here. It's always interesting to read case studies from different contexts and try to also find out how they fit within any research agenda. Overall, the committee very much enjoyed reading your thesis. We are very happy to see that it integrates several empirical cases with a thorough theoretical framework and a background, and that you're also being able to address both mitigation and adaptation, which is something that not a lot of theses do. Many only focus on one or the other. We're very excited to also see that you had very rich empirical material, as you showed in your graph earlier. You had several different cities and over 200 plans of spatial planning and SCAs that you looked at. And that you also had case studies from Norway in one of the papers. We also want to compliment you on the progress that you've done on your papers. I think it's a very good news to hear that all of them have now been gone through review and will be published, and also in very high quality ranked journals. From my personal perspective, I was very happy to read a very thorough discussion on the philosophy of science and your critical realist standpoint. This is something that doesn't come across in a lot of theses anymore, so that was a very good discussion. There are a number of critical points that we'd like to raise, and I will start first and then Hans will follow with his own, and Arne third. First of all, I would like to ask you to reflect on the sort of overall sort of literature discussion on climate change governance. In many of the articles you start with discussion on how cities have become these front runners in climate change governance, and you cite authors such as Harriet Bulkley, Canon Alba, these people, and they're very much the discourse is about, national governments are slow, cities are doing it much faster. Simultaneously, there's a body of literature that examines the problems associated with sort of the uptake of adaptation mitigation at the local level. And I would perhaps put your thesis in that body of literature. And I was wondering how you to reflect on this difference between the two bodies of literature. How can cities at one hand be the front runners and do everything, whilst at the same time they're still suffering from many of the sort of difficulties in terms of implementing these kinds of new issues into their decision making?
Thank you. It's a very good question. Well, one of the issues I think is that at the national level, the state government level, has been more or less invisible in climate change. And they've been very reluctant to even put out overall policies on this area. And even if they make climate change at the national level plans and policies, it's very much based on ad hoc basis and very little on what guidelines to what can you actually do. And I think the reason that the main actions take place at the cities is for mainly two. One is that it's good branding to have an environmentally friendly city that focus on green growth and that wants to make the city a nice synergies with the city of good city to live in, the discourse of the good life, and especially the large cities take it up as a brand area. And another thing is that climate change impacts are at the very local level. So these cities that experienced the impacts of climate change, especially flooding in the northern part of Europe and in the US, know that they will have to make some kind of planning at the moment. I think the national level is also influenced by some of the work done in the COP meetings. It's very difficult to agree upon what kind of emission levels they should head for, and to come with some concrete actions within that area. And there's also there's many conflicts in relation to at the national level as well, the different parties, and the media is also very much focused on the national level, and can come in conflict with other policy areas as well. And I think there's this review made by Concito, a Danish think tank, the Danish municipalities, where they investigated some of the barriers for the climate change integration. That mentioned that the cities that are the most proactive are the ones experiencing the largest challenges. So there's also development from
Largest challenges in terms
of integration.
yeah.
So there's also development from having a good intention by making a thematic voluntary power plan, and to also implement it in practice.
Sure. Secondly, I wanted to, before we go into the details, I wanted to ask you about this concept of climate change planning, and that in relation to both mitigation and adaptation policy making. In the thesis, you acknowledged, rightly so, that many municipalities either address one or the other or both, and perhaps increasingly now both, but it's still in the minority. I think the majority of the plans focus on mitigation, at least during the time that you posted it. And you state also that climate change planning includes both mitigation, adaptation, and/or can be either of those. And I was wondering, as a sort of wider process of environmental policy making, if you include adaptation, mitigation into that, the two seem to be quite different kinds of processes, and they've started at different times, mitigation much earlier than adaptation. And I was wondering, would you be able to sort of reflect on the idea that, to what extent you think that climate change planning as a concept adequately reflects both of them, given that they are fairly different kind of fields and have been dealt differently, either in municipalities or also in research? Is it a concept wide enough to accommodate both? Can it explain both processes as one concept?
If you acknowledge that both processes, the processes around mitigation and adaptation, both are cross-sectional, then it's more like the issue of the process that will be reflected, that will collect the both of them.
Yeah.
Mitigation is both related to these public-private partnerships that occurs very much, especially in some of the Danish cases, and to the energy and heat companies. So the planning of the energy, and then they also include transportation. So it's so these integrated energy plans are coming. They're increasing more and more in Denmark, and that direction also seems to somehow indicate that mitigation and adaptation will not occur in the same plan. But where you can see that mitigation and adaptation would fit into the same plan is where you include the synergies and the trade-offs between the different measures. And whether it has to be in the same plan or whether it should be in an SEA of the plans, I don't really have a specific opinion on what's the best solution about that. But as long as you keep on the process and the process of looking at that this is a comprehensive planning area, then I feel that the process you can. Yeah.
I have a few specific questions about your research questions from page 15, and I wanted to ask in terms of clarification whether you would be able to sort of reflect a little bit on the term institutional implications. What do you mean by implications in this regard? And how, and secondly, the second part of the main research question, how do the municipalities seek to solve these issues? Does this imply that the municipalities actively are seeking to solve the problem of climate change integration?
When I chose implications, I more or less just meant constraints.
But institutional specifically?
Yeah, that leads to the structure again that I then define later on, and what is the constraints within the institutions of municipalities, defined by normative, cultural, cognitive, and regulative. And the municipalities seek to solve this is because, for one thing, is that in terms of the municipalities, it's because I focus on the municipalities that already have climate change plans. And I had the assumption behind this work that they will, because I experienced already from my time in Aarhus municipality that there were constraints, and I could see from the conferences and seminars that I participated in nationally that other municipalities experienced the same. So in order, from an ideal point of view, in order to carry these plans out, they will somehow have to solve these constraints to be able to make implementation in practice. But then looking intra-institutional, looking into the each municipalities, then it's not the municipality that try to solve these, it's actually the municipality that makes the constraints on the implementation. And to specify or to make the research question more clear, I could have made a distinction and somehow integrate actors within the research question.
That's actually my final question on the research question. Since your thesis very much focuses on the agency structure, or both of them, what are the institutional implications? Are there no implications for the actors? And should that have been part of the research?
Yeah, it could have been, yeah.
Good. I want to focus on some conceptual questions next, and focus on the three specific concepts that are widely used in your thesis. Climate change or climate governance, climate change integration, climate change planning. And I, first of all, want to look at page 6, where you define these, and you also had a slide up in your presentation. And although each of the concepts themselves are they're on page 6 in the second paragraph, and I wanted to ask you to clarify the relationships. That's the slide that I was talking about.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, how do these concepts relate to each other? And whether you could explain how climate change planning relates to integration and then the governance. Is governance sort of an overarching umbrella term? You could maybe do that.
Yeah, of course they interrelate, these concepts, and sometimes I also use them a bit interchangeable in the thesis. this of course this is the characteristics of the plans and the making of the plans. And then there's the attempt to integrate either the measures related to climate change or the plans itself into the municipality, into the administration. And the making of the plan making of the climate change and the process around that will somehow overlap with the integration process and also the governance, the approach that they do so. Where governance then, I find this, of course, is an umbrella, but it's also characteristics of how this approach will look like over time. It's not very clearly explained, but I can maybe exemplify it with Aarhus municipality, where they, in the plan making, they started to mimic the plan making of a normal municipal plan, and they made a climate change plan that related to the different actors taking place within transportation and within spatial planning. And the integration of these then would then be, well, you can see like the characteristics of the actual plan then changed over time because the focus changed or the approach to integrate changed. And you can see that the governance approach that developed over time is now differently from the one that they had in the beginning.
Right.
It would be easier if I could make it more visual.
I had one more question in relation to climate change integration, because you say that it's distinguished from implementation.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, how does then implementation, if it's different from integration, is implementation part of planning, or is it a separate?
Well, implementation, I perceive as when you implement specific actions into practice. And I don't include that level in my analysis. For one reason, because it's been very early to look at implementation.
Yes, I think for everywhere. So I think and that's actually a distinction that many don't make in the literature, where they just talk about you know, adaptation is happening, but they don't make that distinction. So I think it's quite good that you make that distinction here. I wanted to focus on research design very briefly, and as I mentioned in the beginning, you make a very clearly your epistemological stance in terms of where you start from, and that it allows you to focus on structure and agency. On page 27, you further discuss how a critical realist standpoint enables you to focus on climate change governance and climate change planning, and you actually make a distinction between the two. And I was wondering if you could clarify that a little bit in terms of what you mean when you say that climate change governance is entangled in the intermesh of structure and agency in the context of municipal organizations. And further on, you say the distinction between agency and structure becomes even more essential in climate change planning. I was wondering if you could explain that a little bit.
Yeah, for the governance part, it's more the understanding of the interaction at the moment and developing a bit over time. And for planning, there's specific measures in the plans, and this is underlying assumption that when we implement the actions of the plan, it will have an impact on practice. For example, if we build a new highway, people will drive on it. So there's some structures there that will influence behavior, and even though if we want to drive another way, we can't do that because we have to follow the road somehow. So that is where the critical realism aspects come in, that these structures, they occur over longer time than the actors do. And then there's also this perspective of that we have an assumption that when we carry out the plan, it will have an impact for future behavior, which is not part in a lot of the structure agency debate, which focus more on the discourses and the way that actors, the way that people talk about things.
Sure.
So that's why I kind of distinguish it. Governance is more like the process of carrying out stuff more than it's actual carrying it out.
Good. Moving on to methodology, and when we're talking about 5 different projects, possibly more because there was always also the Norwegian case, it's always a challenge to be able to ask interesting questions about methodology, but I have managed. So. In your, I think a wider trend in social sciences on the whole is that there is this move towards qualitative research on the whole. And I was wondering, in terms of your research, how you position yourself within this debate. And I wanted to specifically ask about your statement on page 34, where you say that you use a mixed methods approach. And by definition, mixed methods approach involves using both quantitative and qualitative research tools or approaches or methods specifically. And I was wondering, given that your thesis is using qualitative methods only, how you would position yourself within the mixed methods approach.
Yeah, when I wrote mixed method, it was in relation to that I draw on other people's empirical work as well. And those empirical works also include quantitative studies. And that depends on how you define quantitative. If you define quantitative as just information that are countable, but does not necessarily include a standard deviation in that form, then I would say it's a mixed method, because I also do such quantitative studies on my own through the document studies of the plants, and use various types of methods. But my analysis are mainly, or they are only qualitative. And yeah.
You mentioned earlier that in terms of the using other people's studies, does that mean in terms of literature or other people's
empirical work? Yeah. It's an overview of the document studies that that is included in the thesis, and I divided it in like primary and secondary are other author studies, and some of it are quantitative and some of them are qualitative. Qualitative, if we go in and look at what is meant in the different sentences of a plant, for example, in kernel and life, we look at when should these climate change plans be environmentally assessed or screened in terms of environmental assessment. And looking at some of these climate change plans, we calculated how many of the different measures included in the plans. And as long as the chart looks like this, I would say it's a quantitative study. But of course, we did not make standard deviation or make statistical data out of it afterwards. And I also analyzed it qualitatively. So I would position myself in the qualitative research. And the only reason that I mention it as a mixed method was because I also draw on other studies and then kind of grasp.
Do you think, playing a devil's advocate, and now I think given the benefit of hindsight, do you think that using that kind of data or adding a fully quantitative sort of approach to your thesis would have added something that you don't have now, if you think?
It will always add.
Well, of course. Would it have been there a specific sort of, perhaps, because to my mind, quantitative and qualitative approaches, they answer different questions. and they can be used as research approaches to sort of say different things about a research problem that you're looking at. And if you combine them to look at a specific problem, you can either, I mean, that's how mixed methods approaches are justified, because you're able to maybe see the research problem more fully. You know, and in terms of this, I mean, do you think that you would have been able to do that in the thesis, to say something more about how climate change is integrated into city governments?
Actually, I actually don't think so, because those studies already been made by Conceo, the Danish think tank, and I also draw a bit on my conclusions, and that was from 2010, so I should have been doing follow-up work from 2010 and forward. If I should have done something else that doesn't include document studies, should been questionnaires, and for the Aarhus case, I would be able to reach many more people than I did with the interviews. So I should have added the questionnaires if it should have contributed something to the research.
One further question on methodology. In the it's the third article where you lead the article with the Norwegian and the Danish cases, and I was wondering then if you could perhaps describe the challenges that are in using qualitative data from different projects and bringing them together into an article, which perhaps from the beginning wasn't meant to sort of be a joint study. And you as a lead author, I mean, you know, what were the main challenges and how did you overcome them?
In the Norwegian-Danish paper. The main challenges were to get insight into the Norwegian data, because it was also protected by the people that carried it out. So I very much relied on the two Norwegian researchers and asking about their approaches and how they carried out their research and where it was documented elsewhere. Because that the questions asked from their interviews and our interviews, or just mine and also Sanne Larsen's studies, it makes what you can call the internal validity of the study a bit questionable. Yeah.
I think that's a common challenge in qualitative research on the whole, if you have, because they're often carried out with a specific sort of framing in mind, and it's then difficult to do that. I'll skip that, and I wanted to ask a specific questions in terms of the third article. Yes, the third article, and we're moving to page 100 now. And here is details on you're basically outlining in the methodology section before that the way that you approach the case in Aarhus municipality, and you have outlined 3 different principal areas in which the construction and contestation take place in terms of the sort of legitimacy of CC planning. And I was wondering, because you don't further give details on why these 3 principal arenas were chosen, could you please elaborate on that a little bit more? The 3 principal areas being the writing of plans, the building of external networks, and the final is, I believe, internal networks and culture. What I'm interested in this study is that because you have a theoretical framework, and then you have the data, and then you have to structure data with the actual the theoretical framework, and I'm interested in why these 3 principal arenas. Where did these come from? How did you decide that these 3 were the most important ones?
I think the 3 principal arenas here leads back to the 3 climate change plans, right?
production of plans,
Oh yeah, of
external
course. Yeah,
networks,
yeah.
and
Okay.
networks internal to all of these kind of things.
Yeah. So, it's because we see, the first arena is because we see a change in the writing of the plans and how the plans are used to create legitimacy. It's like a cognitive legitimacy in the municipalities, but because they've been carrying out plans for like the beginning of their time. So we actually take out some of the things that we draw from the we can see from the interviews and also from the what is stated in the plans and the conceptual framework that we use that is focused on the internal and external environment and related to structure and agency. And because we see, I think the first arena is because we see there's a change in the way it's scoped, and then we use that one to look at why did the focus of the plans change. The first plan was very much related to the traditional way of plan making, and the third plan was very focused on businesses and outreach to businesses and citizens. And the design of the plan is totally different than the first one. It's bright blue, where the first one mimics the design of the department. And then to explain these, we look at, we take the framework in terms of internal and external as an explanation of this change, and then look at structure and agency within the internal and the external. So the first arena is mainly just to say what's relevant here and to notify that the focus of these plans changed.
Good. My time is about to come to an end, so I will ask a few questions about your conclusions. And first of all, I want to focus on page 183, where you outline your contribution to the research area of, I suppose we could roughly call it on urban climate governance or governance. And this is something that you also briefly mentioned in your presentation, that the main finding of your thesis is that it's not necessarily vertical networks or international networks, but mainly local networks that have contributed to the uptake of adaptation and integration. Would that be a fair statement to make? You used the term multi-level governance here, that it also happens at the local level. What do you mean by multi-level here?
I mean that it also occurs multi-level in the sense that they have the region, and they have that includes several municipalities, and they have the businesses, and they have the triple helix, the businesses, the universities, and the local government. Some of them also network up with the NGOs. And I think the focus, well, the difference, I mean, when I say the local level, is that it goes vertically to the region as well. It doesn't necessarily go to the national level. It sometimes do when Aarhus or Copenhagen have meetings within the ministry. Yeah. But that it's very much the main focus is on local development.
It's interesting because I have been part of a study where we specifically looked at multi-level governance, and I'm wondering whether this is a case of when all you have is a hammer in your hand and everything looks like a nail, and because we specifically sort of found that there were several sort of multi-level networks that went across to national, or to actually mainly to international. I'm wondering whether you specifically from the beginning of the study ruled out this and didn't focus on them, or they just simply didn't exist. Because we found local networks too, but we didn't find them as influential as.
No, it came up in the interviews. When I asked about how they, in the first article with the 8 Danish municipalities, I asked them about how do you implement these in practice, and what has influenced your work. And specifically in Aarhus, we asked what is the importance of, because they also signed up for Covenant of Mayors and ICLA, the Danish Association for Nature Conservation and Climate Communities. And they specifically stated that, well, it's only to show to the city council that they committed to this. So it doesn't play a role for their daily work at all.
I think that in terms of the urban climate change governance literature, I think this is an important finding. In terms of wider planning literature or social scientific literature, networks and their importance has been sort of acknowledged some time ago. How do you think that you can contribute to this wider body of literature?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
No, what I meant is that in terms of urban climate literature, I think definitely the cross-scale networks have been acknowledged for some time, and also in wider social scientific planning literature, networks on the whole have been sort of quite a studied area, and their importance has been acknowledged. What would you say that your contribution to outside of the urban climate governance literature, what do you bring with this thesis?
First of all, I bring a study that is more detailed in terms of defining the actual constraints and barriers for integration and implementation. And I hope that I also open up for research, similar research to be carried out in other countries, to have more focus on, to make comparative studies on the constraint and how these municipalities or try to overcome these constraints to secure implementation. So looking more into the drivers at the very local level. I would like the literature to, first of all, I contribute with this very detailed focus on the local level, but I would also like the literature to be more focused on what needs to be done to aid practice, and that looking at the drivers as well as the barriers, more than looking into how it occurs at the several scales, because I think what they miss is what is constraining these actions to actually be implemented. And referring to the question you started with in the beginning, then how come is it that cities are in the forefront and still they're also struggling with the implementation part? And I think there's a gap there in the literature.
Do you think that your theoretical framework with the structure agency, could that be applied multi-scale, and if so, what would it look like? Do you think it has potential for that?
Well, yes, I think so. And I think the key is also to look at the aspect of legitimacy, because legitimacy helps in focusing on how this change is framed, and also on, like, it also has the solution part in it, because it looks into how the different, let's say, actors, because it can also be like groups or units or municipalities defined depending on how you define actors, but making the research more focused on like the next step. Now we've figured out that climate change is occurring at different levels, but also making on how to overcome all these management problems actually.
I think I'm going to leave it here. We had one joint question with Ken's, but I think I'm going to leave it for you now. You can pick it up. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, first I would like to make a very big compliment to your thesis. I think it's a very interesting thesis. It's a very topical issue that you raise, because it's not only interesting and topical for the Danish situation, but I think in many Western European countries and elsewhere we see municipalities struggling with how to adapt to climate change, how to start up mitigation policies, how to gain legitimacy for it. So it's very interesting, very topical. I think also your approach is very novel in terms of you try to understand all these struggles, not in terms of these clinical list of barriers to adaptation, which I think over 80 authors have already assembled, including me and colleagues, which is quite boring and doesn't lead to a very good understanding of why is it so difficult. And I think your conceptualization of these institutional entrepreneurs who try to gain legitimacy for mitigation and adaptation policies and use all kinds of strategies in terms of internal strategies, but also these externally oriented strategies, mobilizing networks, reframing the issue. It's very interesting and it leads to a better understanding. I'm also impressed by the amount of scientific papers that you produced in highly ranked journals, also what Circo was referring to. I mean, you told me a month ago in Hamburg that you effectively had 2 years for your PhD research work, and then, well, producing 5 papers. I think it's really impressive, and many colleagues will be jealous. So, also a big compliment. And I'm very happy that I was given the opportunity to be part of the defense committee, because it was a very good excuse to actually read your thesis. Normally we don't have the time, and now I was forced to read it and to learn from it. Okay, so this was the good part. I was informed that I should prepare some critical questions. I would like to start with that now. And the first one is about the generalizability of your research. I find that you're ambivalent in that respect. At some places you say, well, generalizability is not a goal, chapter 10 for instance, or you say, oh, it's still possible within the framework chosen, chapter 5, but at other places you implicitly or explicitly suggest that these results are generalizable. For instance, well, you consider the Nordic countries as exemplary, as environmental frontrunners, critical case for the learning process about the challenges of climate change and for the strategies to overcome these, on page 14, page 183. You also try to expand the external validity so that your conclusions can be generalized, on page 38. Arus considered an extreme case, and also referring to work by Circo and others, you say, well, these Nordic, Scandinavia is very interesting because they are front running, which makes me a bit pessimistic about climate integration in other countries, because Denmark already is struggling so much with integrating climate change in their policies. Well, what about the rest of the world? So my first question is, to what extent can we generalize your results, and what results? And yeah, I would like to ask you to reflect on that first.
Yeah. So, looking at the levels that I have of the studies, you can generalize to some extent on the 2 first papers, and then it becomes more difficult when you go into the detailed case study of Aarhus. And of course, I would like to generalize about my work, but I'm also a bit reluctant to do so because it's also very context specific. And when I refer to that the Scandinavian countries are critical cases, then I also refer to Carl Wejs, some of his work. The way I think you can generalize on my work is that, especially from the conceptual framework, that you can use that conceptual framework and you can use the interlinkage between structure and agency and in terms of legitimacy. But you cannot generalize the results from the case study of Aarhus, for example, or within the Danish municipalities as such, because it's a specific Scandinavian context, and the German and especially the UK planning-wise is very differently. When Aarhus is stated as an extreme case, it's an extreme case within Denmark because of its government form, which is called the magistrate regime. This is the most bureaucratic government form in Denmark and still running. It would not be an extreme case in the UK, for example, because the system is much more bureaucratic setup. But from that single case study, you can't generalize before you make similar case studies, and where the conceptual framework might be a potential good tool to do so.
Okay, but if I cite you on page 38, you literally state, this study is based on previous studies. It was initiated because of similar findings. Its external validity is strengthened so that its conclusions to a great extent can be generalized. Then I'm wondering, generalized in what respect? For the topic of climate integration, not for the theoretical framework? Do you think?
But yeah, to a greater extent, what I want to see is, because then I maybe have framed it in a bad way, which is not impossible.
Well, let me help you a bit. You state that the Nordic countries, they are more or less front-running. Do you think that other municipalities have more troubles?
Because the government forms within the Scandinavian countries is relatively flat compared to many other countries. So you can say at a very overall level that if the Nordic countries are having constraints in integrating climate change, that is very much likely to be the same in other countries. But going deeper into the details of the studies, I find it looking at what is causing the different constraints. I think it would be too limited to generalize from that perspective.
And if you look at strategies to overcome constraints, do you think the ones that you found, the ones that I'm just referring to, the internally versus the externally oriented strategy, do you think these are really specific for Denmark, or do you think they may also be found elsewhere, or do you expect other strategies to be prevalent elsewhere?
Well, looking at the local networks and the public-private partnerships, it's not that it only occurs in Denmark; it also occurs in other countries. I know you made a study in Holland as well, in the Netherlands. But Denmark's has many incentives for public-private partnerships and many funds where you could apply for projects together with the local government, together with the businesses could apply for funding to carry out projects. In that sense, motivating for public-private partnerships. So there's also another background for another tradition within other fields than climate change on making local partnerships together. And then they use that arena to legitimize climate change, and it also has an effect internally in the municipality when the organizations are so large, and it's difficult to work internally, and then they bypass it by working externally. I wouldn't know if that's a strategy for providing legitimacy in other countries before studies focused on that has been made.
Okay. Let's move on with the second question, and that's about the institutional entrepreneurs. I've never seen one in real life, so I'm really interested in how they look like. Can you say a bit more? I mean, you've met them, you've identified them. Could you say something about, well, what are their motivations? Why do they do what they do? And more from a theoretical perspective, what's institutional about them? What makes them institutional entrepreneurs? And also, how are they different from what Kingdom calls policy entrepreneurs? Because I thought, well, I see a lot of resemblances, but you've chosen to not call them policy entrepreneurs, but institutional entrepreneurs. So, please answer to that.
For the first question, how does this person look like?
Is there one in the audience?
There's several actually. Martin is one, and I'll say Arne is one as well. My dad is one for sure. And these are people that doesn't really look differently, but they have always a lot of projects going on, and very often way too many for what they have time for, and they have a certain focus on, like they have like a mission they want to carry out, and they go for this mission. And there's some authors that distinguish between this very enthusiastic and outgoing type of entrepreneur to one who is more a daily entrepreneur carrying out the daily work. And my focus is very much on the ones that seems to have a mission, and they really have a desire for that mission, and you can always say that they have a soul or fire for that specific topic. And they don't see constraints as barriers, they see them as possibilities to find another solution and try to change them. And the reason that I chose institutional is because it relates to my theoretical point of view. Like a dear kid has many names, so like they've used indistinguishable policy entrepreneurs, institutional entrepreneurs. But where I can see that like some of these entrepreneurs also want to change the mindset of the organization, because it was one of what came up with the interview of the climate manager in Aarhus. And he was very focused on changing the mindset of the whole municipality to work more conceptual in general.
So that makes him an institutional entrepreneur, not a policy entrepreneur. Or is it all the same?
You can use them interchangeable. I just didn't look into whether the way that when I define institutional entrepreneur, I looked into the literature that define champions, that define policy entrepreneurs, that define institutional entrepreneurs, and then looked into how do we characterize the entrepreneur part of it, the champion part of it.
Would your analysis have been different if you would have used the concept of policy entrepreneur and also Kingdom's model? Would you then think that different types of analysis or perhaps different findings?
I'm not familiar with the Kingdom's model. I don't know if he's more focused on policy making and plans and policies. Because if they had a focus more on the making of the plans and the decision making processes throughout policy plans and projects, the focus of the entrepreneurs would be more internally. Focus would be more internally in the municipality, and I might have lacked some of the external focus.
Yeah. Okay. Third question, something which really interested me when I met you in Helsinki last year during the Nordic Adaptation Conference. Was that someone told me about the new Danish law that required municipalities to actually implement or develop and implement adaptation plans. It's also something that you mentioned I think it was in the introduction to your thesis. But you explicitly say that you, it's a new development, it's not addressed, but you say, this new regulatory development shows that climate change planning is a continuous emerging field of planning. and then there it stops. And I think I would have expected more. And I would like to ask you to reflect on two things. One is, how can you explain this new law? Because apparently at the national level, climate planning has gained legitimacy, and it has now what you call a normative pillar. So how can you explain that from your model? And the second is, how do you think this will impact on municipal planning, and will it make institutional entrepreneurs redundant in terms of climate integration? So how can you explain it, and what will be the consequences?
So what will happen now this new law is come into place is that the regulatory pillar, especially for adaptation, has been strengthened very much. And it also means that the municipalities, they must make climate change plans.
Mm-hmm.
And it will push them also in developing flood risk assessments of the municipal area. Not all of them have done so. So in that sense, it will also push some of the planning forward in this area, and hopefully also collect some experience within it. They then also strengthened the normative pillar because they initiated a task force that that goes around to the different municipalities and help them in how to make these climate change plans. And I think I have two students in the back that can tell more about how effectively these task forces they are in practice. But since what I've seen so far, the institutional entrepreneurs have taken place within the mitigation agenda more than in the adaptation. So in that sense, I don't think it will undermine the role of the institutional entrepreneurs. But if it will have a good outcome, so far it's very difficult to say, and if the municipalities will make good solutions, because as the law now saying, it's also difficult to say, because they will have to work then across municipalities to mainstream the scenarios that they use, if they use scenarios for flooding, and also how high they will build, for example, dikes, so that one municipality not build a higher dike than the neighboring one and then lead water to move the problem from one municipality to another. Has been seen in Lolland, for example.
Okay, but in terms of this framework, I mean, you have three types of legitimacy. I can imagine that the normative pillar and cultural cognitive pillar are no longer interesting because there's a law, so there's legitimacy. Simple.
Well, what you see in the SCA, which is also a regulative, which also falls in the regulative pillar, is that it very much relies on the discretion of the actors and their beliefs on how to implement this law in practice. So it does not necessarily leave out the actor level or the normative or the cultural cognitive pillar, because they will have some practices that they rely on and then they build upon when they make these adaptation plans.
Mm-hmm. But do you agree that it will become less important? I mean, now in the current situation, you've observed that regulative legitimacy
No, I
is
don't. No, I think the normative and especially cognitive, that they're taking for granted practices around this area might differ between the municipalities, and that will influence how this law is carried out in practice. For example, the SCA, that the focus previous was on the microclimate, and the practitioners didn't even think of then assessing global climate change, because they always just assessing the microclimate, and had an assumption that climatic factors means microclimate.
Okay. Well, let's discuss further the SEA part of your thesis and the discretionary power. what you state is that well, SEA has limited success in terms of promoting climate integration, and you say, well, that's due to confusion. Eh? Or what you now also say is that they think it's about microclimate and about the meaning of SEA regulations. But I could be more skeptical and more pessimistic, and I would like to share something with you, a particular framing of this situation. I would like to ask you to reflect on, well, is that also possible, and what would be the explanations? This is the pessimistic view. I would say you could see SEA, it has discretionary power, discretionary room, which creates some form of institutional void. It's something that you also use, which creates room for agency, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the practitioners say, oh, well, we're confused and we don't know. But what if this is strategic behavior? I mean, from research in the Netherlands, we know that many planners, they see SEA, environmental impact assessment, as obstacles. And they want to develop something, and then they have to do an SEA, and all new kinds of impacts should be assessed. Well, they prefer not to do an SEA. So, could it be possible that they use their discretionary room in order to circumvent SEA regulations, and then say, well, it's also difficult, but that in fact it is just strategic behavior?
Yes, definitely. We also see that in our work, and especially in the fifth paper, where this lawyer also says that he never gets any phone calls about SEA and the questions about whether to do assess this or that in SEA is always EIA.
Mm-hmm.
And in relation, do you want me to relate it to climate change, the climate change adaptation plans? I think that, and it's my own interpretation, that climate change adaptation for some of the municipalities, even that it's now demanded that they have to do it, they can also see the benefit of doing so because the purpose is to avoid flooding. And for the Copenhagen case, they had insurance companies knocking on their door after the 2nd July flood. And then they went up the hierarchy and went to the ministry and knocked on the door. That there was a need for this law, and several of the municipalities through local government Denmark asked for this law to come in place so that they could get some help to do and some guidelines to how to do these climate change plans. So I think the setup here is significant differently from the SEA work. But of course the way that they want to frame these plans and the way that the practices that they will include this plan making in to some extent relies to the previous practices, and then on top of that the utility companies being privatized in Denmark a few years ago, so that they, in terms of climate change, now also have to work together with the utility companies as a private company, and the infrastructure, some of the infrastructure like the transportation department and the buildings department. So there's also in these normative guides for climate change adaptation emphasized like the help for the process and the cross-sectoral process that's developing. So that it comes from the municipalities themselves, especially those that experience severe flooding already. I think that makes a difference for practice, and I don't think that they will, in that sense, try strategically to avoid it unless that they don't have any incidents of flooding at all.
Okay. Is there room for one more question? Yes. I have a difficult question, which is easy to pose, so that makes it good for me. But it's about the role of a factor which you touch upon and which you do not elaborate in detail, and that's the role of power. that's something. Well, let me quote you. On page 109, you state that the concept of legitimacy has connections with a number of other potentially important explanatory concepts, notably power, authority, and salience. Before grounding legitimacy in this research, we have treated related concepts considerably more superficially. Of course, you have to focus and narrow down. But I would like to ask you to reflect more on the relevance of power in the cases that you examined, and to what extent it explains the levels of legitimacy that you found, and also how it relates to climate change integration and the interplay between structure and agency. It's
It went
indeed
easy,
a
but-
very easy question.
We're gonna have a lot of time.
You could also link legitimacy to how to create power for the actions that you want to implement. And the first thing that came into my mind when you mentioned the question is the authority of the climate units when they are placed so low in the hierarchy of the municipal organization. And it comes up in many of the interviews if it would be better if the unit was placed in the mayor's office, the department of the mayor's office, because then they would have more power, more legitimacy in terms of going across the different sectors. So yes, that perspective could have been taken to a large extent than it's been here. The reason that I did not do this was because power analysis very often is affiliated with discourse analysis. And for me, coming from a natural science bachelor and feel very much as a natural science, though working with social sciences, I had an interest in knowing how do we, like from an ideal point of view, how do we get these actions implemented into practice? And then I found, because power is also a very broad concept, working from direct power to indirect power to, you can remember we in one of our courses as a student I had this iceberg of power, different levels of power. So it's also a very broad concept, and I found legitimacy was more operationalizing possibility for me to use.
Could it be synonyms? Power
No.
and legitimacy?
No.
How are they different?
Because power is like it's a huge concept and defined in various ways as well. I'm only familiar with the literature from some of the way the literature made of Ben Fluger and Richard. Tim Richards, I'm sorry, who's like participating today. And their work related to how like the meaning of things and the discourses of things relates also to power. But it's also very often used in some of the work of Anthony Giddens and his concepts of structure and agency.
Okay.
The advantage of being chair of a committee is that you can organize so you are the last person and there's nothing left to say. So, except for we also like the front page. Except I was thinking there's some similarities to the tower in Aarhus. So that is a little bit critical comment then. Anyway, the Lord Mayor's Tower in Aarhus looked a little similar. So, but anyway, the deal was also there was in the appendix there was an article in Danish, so I could also take this article. So that is the leftovers for me. No, and I won't go into saying all the nice words because it has already been said. So I will try to pick up a few things that hasn't been said already. It's not much left, but I will find some, I think. Yeah, let's see what happens the next half hour. I was a little bit, I very much like your theoretical ambitions, and also going into this with structure and agency. But I was also a little bit surprised that you didn't try more to bring these concepts down to earth, you could say. Because at least in some of the series you touch upon with learning theories and so on, they are also very similar concepts that perhaps could bring it more operational and also be more obvious in the analysis of the empirical cases. For example, in some, one obvious on the agency part is all this with participation and with brokers as another concept similar to the one you use, institutional entrepreneurs and so on. So I just, to begin with that, your reflection on how to bring these concepts more in play into the empirical analysis also.
You want me to reflect
Yeah.
on that?
Yep.
Well, my conceptual framework is developed through the the 5 articles, and yeah, I think I could have used various concepts also, but I chose these like the new institutional theory, and because I found that new institutional theory didn't necessarily fit in the sense that it include the role of actors. I could have looked into, like, it could have changed my theoretical focus totally at that time when I saw that it did not fit. But I became aware of this whole new strand, emerging strands of new institutional theory, and I found that very interesting, that I was not the only one that found that this theory doesn't necessarily include the role of actors. So I actually spent quite a lot of time in looking into those theories and looking into some of Anthony Giddens, because he's a classical person to look into, and he's been an upcoming author again in the past 10 years. So
Writing
yeah.
on climate change, by the way. Anyway.
Yeah. And looked into like the criticism of both theories and tried to grasp that also with the emerging strength in new institutionalism. Is to see, like, could there be emerge of the best of the two worlds, so to speak. And then I saw that it also fit very well with my understanding of critical realism, and developed into that. And they, of course, because some of them are classical authors, they use abstract terms, and I'm somehow also inspired by that. So yes, but if I get the chance to look more into the public participation part, which is even more pragmatic than what I've looked into, then it would be interesting to look at those strands as well.
I'll come back to this several times, so keep it in mind. What I want to move on is this one, and I really like the way you have developed it further and combined the two also and so on. But if I think I see perhaps you could use it even more than you do, because if you look into you have another article where you're looking into learning, and somehow all this area here is very much about the learning aspect, and then we were touching upon this with power, and you could say another, as I see it, another issue creating dynamics and change is also that you have conflicting interests. So therefore you need negotiations and so on. So I like it, and I think it's also kind of a way of make it more operational, these type of discussions. But again, to follow up on this with the power, because I guess in the specific cases you will also find a lot of this type of compromising between different interests. At least there's huge debate between the farmers and the municipalities on different type of aspects when it comes to adaptation, for example. So it is out there, but it's not that much in your thesis.
And that's also why I included it in the presentation and the very end of the result part, because it's also like one of the disadvantages is making a paper-based thesis is that I, not in the same extent, can merge the results from all the different studies. And yes, I agree with you. There's a great potential in this model, and also in explaining that you can jump from one stage to another, and how does that change the curve. Yeah, what is it?
One aspect you leave out that Karen Christensen is in fact mentioning is that we very much like to be up in this programming situation. So she has in fact a part saying that there's a lot of premature jumping in here, and then you are like when we play Ludo, you are hit back to start and have to do a special effort to get started again. So this jumping into here, because that is not what you want to indicate with these arrows. That is more the institutional, the process, the dynamics, the change. But I guess that will perhaps also be an issue, this premature jumping into saying, okay, we are up here, we know what to do.
Yeah, there's a risk that you will miss some aspects. I don't have an example of what has been the case, because there would be more detailed studies, for example, of Albert Slund and Colling, the two cases that I include. But yeah, I think also I included this gray area here to sure. Well, I'm not sure I write it explicitly in the paper, but the thought behind it was that these boxes are not necessarily, and they can be overlapping and you can move from one to another.
You didn't write it, but I was guessing right. But what surprised me was that you are somehow filling in your municipalities in 3 of these boxes.
Yeah.
How does that fit with the dynamics and the institutionalization as a process?
Well, the reason that I do it is because I find that many of them, of course, is not having institutionalized climate change yet. It's also a process, and I find it's interesting that they don't see the same challenges. So I categorize them in terms of how the process is characterized.
But then we go a little bit into this with methods again, because I would be more careful of saying when you put municipalities in a box, it will be a snapshot.
Definitely.
It will be what is the situation at the moment you are doing the study, and there is a history and there is a future, and they will perhaps next time we go there be in another situation.
So my example with Aarhus, that the first study within this paper, they were in the negotiation category, and now when I interviewed them a year and 2 years afterwards, they moved to the experimental part because it was too difficult to be up there.
But I guess it's rather important because to stress the snapshot part of it, because otherwise you'll somehow have to leave this part out, that they are actually moving around.
Yeah.
So I was thinking this of the institutional entrepreneur. How do you see the role of the institutional entrepreneur combined with this? Because perhaps, there are also different type of people behind the different boxes, you could say.
Yeah, it's very evident that the institutional entrepreneurs, they prefer to be in the experimental category because they can move faster, and that relates to the interpretation of having a mission, and they can carry out this mission more or less as fast as possible. And it's also interesting to see that the approach of Aarhus changed when they hired a climate change manager that had come from the private sector and had his own consultancy company carrying out different projects as well. But it's not that simple as well, because there's also other things in Aarhus that made this change possible to move more in the experimental category. And it's definitely the type of institutional entrepreneurs that I work with are very project-oriented. Less than they find that it's interesting to interact with bargaining and negotiation processes internally in the municipality. They like to act. It's one of the interviews also says that before we made plans, now we act.
Okay. Could it be that you should do all four things at the same time?
Definitely. And there will be some aspects of each, but then there will be one aspect that might be emphasized above the all. Because still, it's not that they don't experience negotiation with internally in the municipality. Not at all. The main part of the process and what they're focused on is the external and the work with businesses. And the same is in Skive and also in Lolland. The institutional entrepreneur in Lolland is not very well, doesn't have a very good reputation in the planning department, because he kind of just calls when he wants to have the zoning plans changed. And he has the legitimacy to do so because he's experienced as one that attracts development to the municipality.
In fact, in Aarhus they have an education called Carol Pilot, so they should have more activities down here also. Anyway, I was then moving on. Oops, that was too far moving. I was thinking, because you have these 8 municipalities, and you try to define different aspects. But I was again thinking this with agency participation and so on. Couldn't it have been part of the analysis also this with to what extent external networks are? It's not really possible to see it from here, but this type of issues, couldn't they have been part of the analysis also?
Yeah, definitely. Do you want it to be in the analysis, or do you want it to be in this chart?
Well,
What's your question?
yeah, both or whatever.
Yeah.
No,
The point with this chart is just to map out how, like, the characteristics of the plans and the organization behind these plans, and where they get the resources from.
Yeah. But in fact, on one of the last articles, you are, for example, discussing this with having strategic environmental assessment versus local agenda 21, and it's part of the history of some of these municipalities you mentioned, but that is a couple of hundred pages later, and somehow it forms a part of the history and a part of the understanding why they are doing things like they do.
Yeah, and also in Kolding, they had what they themselves called institutional entrepreneur at the political level, that was a part of eClick,
Yeah.
and that was driving the whole sustainability agenda in Kolding.
And
But
it
I
was
only
that for
have-
many years, so in that sense, the
Yeah.
external network was very
Yeah.
important in
Yeah.
the case of Kolding.
Yeah.
And they also have the green network, so there
Yeah.
was
And that's
also
different.
some
That's
collaboration between
the,
them.
the external network has been a larger role in Kolding and Albertslund as well.
Yeah.
But not in the municipalities that just started up the climate change agenda without having a strong emphasis on sustainability.
Okay, if we move on, that will perhaps more be a comment, I think, because, well, you can also answer to a comment, because you have this one, let me see, and then is it, no, it's the next one. I skipped this because it was this one I want to comment on. You're going into this with the learning figures, and you have this in the beginning of the chapter, and then you have a rather similar one, I would say, in the end. But I somehow found them too similar. Perhaps because there was missing this going in between and the stuff not fitting. And you have this going into the empirical case. So I was somehow, you are adding something, but if you look into the figure again, you see that rather few things that it's added maybe on the empirical. You are basically more
The other
developing
table
the
is in
concept.
The other table is in the conclusion
Yeah,
of the paper.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in the conclusion we try to level out the differences between the anticipatory cases, and we can say like the cases that are proactive and the cases that are reactive, obligatory. Yeah, but it was what we could draw out of the existing material, that if we could have done some follow-up interviews, that of course would have been better.
And then, of course, I didn't have the time to look into the sources behind the learning, but it looks very much as something called single loop and double loop learning. And I was thinking about this. It can perhaps be in your articulation, but in the double loop learning is the understanding of that when you have things routinized, you also have perhaps the capacity to question should we do things in a completely other way and so on. So questioning the fundamentals and norms and values and procedures and so on. So is there any indication of this double loop? Let's do it in a completely another way.
It's been in the Norwegian proactive case, where you can see some of the double loop learning, where they took part in seminars and they tried to engage the university of the area to frame how to approach climate change adaptation within that specific area. So they had this thought of how do we approach this differently and what is needed, and instead of just sitting back and waiting for information or trying to do the same as they always did. But not in the Danish case as proactive. It's been explorative approach and this mission for carrying out projects and attracting companies and growth to a specific case.
Are there any Norwegians in the room? Partly. Normally they are radicals. They are fundamentalists in this area. Why doesn't it show up in the cases? Peter Ness taking the train to Copenhagen, even he should stand a race at 3 o'clock in the morning and so on. So you find a lot of these much more radical environmentalists, you can say.
Yeah, but like both cases are situated at the west coast of Norway, and they experience hard weather all the time. So in the reactive case, they also say that you experience hard weather, like always. So they don't perceive climate change as much like what you can say a threat or a challenge in terms of adaptation.
We'll come back to that, but just because if we should go back to the other figure we discussed before, then this is the experimentation part, and this with the compromising conflict resolution and so on, perhaps should also be thought. That is just an idea for the next article. I think that somehow, because in my viewpoint, it's also part of the institutional dynamics that you have these compromising processes and so on. So it's part of the ongoing changes, as I see. But if you should, any ideas, just to make it a question, any ideas on how to include this with the conflicts and the different interests more in the analysis?
Conceptual-wise,
Yeah.
what we work with, what is the main problem with this paper is that we of course work with empirical material that we already had, and was interested in the similarities but also the differences, and to explain some of the differences between municipalities that are front runners and municipalities that take some actions but not really move in that agenda. And for the interviews, the empirical material we had, it's difficult to look very much into the detail of the agency and structure interlinkage within all four cases. Then I would have liked to have access to the Norwegian cases as well, and be looking through the transcripts of the interviews that they made. To make it more explicit in that sense. But of course there's potential to do so. But it would be the best if it could be with follow-up interviews.
Yes. Okay, then I was thinking about this with how we frame these issues, and you are dealing both with mitigation and adaptation, and you have all these nice figures with trade-offs, synergies, and so on. But what about this with the? At least I got the feeling sometimes that you were mainly talking about mitigation when you found these institutional entrepreneurs that were able to bridge to a business development agenda also. So are they not there when it comes to the adaptation side, or how is it?
It's from the work I've done, it seems that adaptation's been on the side and not taking so much. It's included in the plan, but the actual practice of it is taking place in another department. And then they communicate about what to include in the climate change plan to some extent. And it's taking a longer time for adaptation to get moving, and it's not till the last year or so that adaptation really has come on the agenda. And they are now trying to work together, like with the municipality and the utility companies and the different municipalities. So since I haven't been making interviews solely with the adaptation people, I'm not able to say if institutional entrepreneurs do not exist within that agenda. Yeah, but it's not that it's easier to do adaptation than mitigation, and they might it might relate more to spatial planning than the experimental mitigation effort has been so far.
Yeah. But you mentioned at least now there is this talk about water as the new clean tech, or what you would call it. They even have a blue clean tech cluster in California. So, at least the last couple of years, and we have also had students working with this, with the water in the city and so on. I think you have a possibility for making a completely other framing. You have the risk of stormwater, and we need to do an investment, and it's a cost, and we have to have a double sewer system and so on, and it's billions of kroners digged into the ground, nobody will notice. Versus green roof, new lakes, and then really integrating in the physical planning of the areas and using it for improving quality of life, like in Aalborg East and so on. Don't we have the same potential within the area of adaptation as within renewable energy?
Same potential
to combine with this green growth.
Yeah, definitely. I think they tried to. The environmental minister went out and say that water is the new wind.
Yeah.
But it's not been. It's not like it's within the energy sector and within the wind sector been subsidized in the same way. So it has also need to find its own footing. Way of growing up in that sense. And when the municipalities take up adaptation, sometimes it also seems like a strategy for improving and the quality of the city in terms of greening the city and making blue areas, making it a nice city to live in, and a healthy city to live in, all these different narratives that it synergies with. And then you can discuss whether or not that they actually need adaptation to climate change, or it's more because it's a good branding word, or in some of those urban areas. I think when it becomes critical for the municipalities to actually do something is when they have to find out how they should adapt, what kind of flooding they can expect, to do the risk assessment, all the beforehand analysis before they make actions to do so. Yeah. And also because the process is then further complicated because they no longer have the same close collaboration with the utility companies. So they have to have a common consensus and make a shared understanding with the utility companies on what to do, so they don't feel that they're in competition about resources. Yeah.
You were talking within adaptation and water, yeah. But that is the same case within renewables, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think the renewable energy sector has had a longer tradition in thinking in other ways of doing things.
You are also staying in New York.
Yeah.
Perhaps you can't see it, but this is Manhattan after Sandy, so there is a blackout of a major part of Manhattan. And that was not even creating a lot of... You were there shortly before.
And after.
What?
And after.
Also after, okay. At least it doesn't seem on a distance that it created, well, perhaps in their mindset, living on Manhattan, but the rest didn't take care. But it's also, my main point is that, of course, this with the risk and these type of disasters are important, but how do we balance? Are we only engaging people by showing this type of pictures, or are we engaging people by talking about quality of life and improvement of areas that are worn down and so on? So, yeah, risk versus quality of life. I should have had another picture also from a sunny day on Manhattan. Yeah. It's a very difficult, very different framing of the issue.
Well, right after this event, Mayor Bloomberg went out in the media and said that they needed an adaptation plan like Copenhagen.
Yeah.
And he also, as a
Fine,
state,
better.
very prominent politician, and saying that he voted for Obama, was also a very clear statement. After this, and the New York Marathon was cancelled. So yes, it has a large impact, but the critics, of course, went out and said that it doesn't necessarily have to be climate change because it's a storm, and how do you measure the difference between a storm and a normal storm and climate change. So there's a lot of politics and a lot of power relations in the debate as well.
Let's go back to Denmark then, and up north to Jørgen. They say here, clear with their energy package. In 5 years we will no longer talk about climate and CO2. In 5 years we will talk instead of sustainability.
Yeah.
Will that be the overarching framing, or how do you see it? Is it another way also of creating this focus on integration and cross-work inside municipalities and so on?
Yes, and just to take the statement first, then I think that it will be another type of sustainability than it was in the 90s, because sustainability at that time was also securing, very like grassroots focused and involving the citizens and having this broad concept of sustainability. And I think climate change changed that agenda to be more concrete. And to be able to focus it on specific measures and action that have to be carried out. So yeah, it can be like the good way of living, and sustainability in a broader concept also make it more possible to look into synergies and trade-offs. But it also conflicts with the resources of the local authority. With all these comprehensive plans and conflicting policies and goals. Then when should we stop? How far should we go? How many resources should we use on the actual plan making? When decisions very often they also made on the top level, the politician wants something to be carried out very fast.
But at least it opened for this with the 3 dimensions, and I think there is a kind of move that it's not just. Normally there has been considered trade-off between economic dimension and the environmental dimension. Now you see more this, because also developing other type of solutions, there is more benefits on both sides, and now the talk of improving quality of life and the social aspect, improving employment and all this stuff also. So somehow, at least I feel there is, and you hear from Aalborg municipality when they were doing their sustainability strategy that, in fact, the politician became engaged when they realized, in fact, there was this triple bottom line, and they could perhaps doing good in several of the dimensions by the type of investments, actions, and so on.
But I totally agree. Just to say that it will be more concrete than the sustainability agenda in the 90s.
Yeah.
These were the good intentions and policies more than it was concrete actions.
But perhaps we need both, because it was also all these 1,000 flowers from the bottom grown.
Yeah.
So it was also the crazy experimentations and this bottom-up initiatives that somehow, except for a few papers, look like in the 21 is nearly absent in your thesis, and that could be besides being good at making
Yeah.
the integration and the cross-sectoral collaboration and all this, also be necessary to bring in the people
Yeah.
and make this bottom-up initiative.
I actually considered doing so.
Okay.
But
You also did when you were a student, or?
yeah. But yeah, I think that the reason I leave it out was one of all due to time, and second of all also that it opens up a lot of other questions that I did not have time to answer when wrapping up the thesis.
Yeah. No, but it's still somehow, because now the main thing you see with your dissertation is this issue of integration.
Yes.
But you could say it's not only an issue of integration if you also need the participation in order to if you don't want to solve this from top down, and that is part of saying, okay, the municipalities have to be more in focus and so on, then we also need to find out the extension part or whatever we should call it, how to increase the local participation.
And there's one thing, in the Danish case, all these green agents, they were called in the 19th, it was subsidized by the state that had the purpose of engaging the public in sustainability projects. But then we had a government shift in 2001 and there was no longer allocated resources for that. And that is a shame with the whole climate change debate at the moment, that it's missing.
Yes, and well, we could continue, but I think I'm very satisfied, and we are getting to the end, I think. Even Marx is racing now. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, 5 minutes left, and I don't know whether the other members of the assessment committee have, through this discussion, have figured out some new questions. If so, please ask them now, and if not, the last word is always Anja, if there are anything to say, but there's a couple minutes left.
I have a personal question. About your normative ideas, your own values. What I saw on page 110 and 178, as you will remember what you said over there. You're very critical about the green growth narrative and partnership and project-based approach to climate change integration. What I feel is that you think these are not good approaches to climate change integration, but they do seem successful in promoting climate change integration. So why are you hesitant about these approaches?
Because I don't think that they, to a large enough extent, includes all the departments, all the sectors of the municipality. And I think that is a shame, because then it will grow into it will be a separate field. The initiatives are good and the projects are good, but it's not more like it's more like a development agenda than it's a planning agenda. And then if they don't manage to get it integrated across, if they do, it's not necessarily a bad thing, it's a good thing, because they do set things in motion. But it might not change anything in terms of the long-term planning of the spatial plan, for example, in the transportation sector, in the building sector. If they just keep on doing work on projects. And for in one example in the municipalities, there was also this tension between this individual and the planning department, and then might cause resistance for improving the integration part into the planning. And the spatial plans are important because they lay out requirements for the zoning plans and requirements, long-term requirements for 30 years.
Okay.
Final words on it?
We don't have to go on to forward.
No, exactly. So let's just. Thank you very much, and I think we should give both.